Come back, Don.
Thank you. So can I just say there's been a whole range of speeches which I feel particularly proud of that people have made, because I think they've been principled speeches which have set out the case very, very clearly. The straightforward issue here is that the judgment basically said the government acted unlawfully. And what I'm surprised at is that there has been no word of apology from the Minister. Not a single word that we got this wrong and therefore we apologise to the House. This is not a technical matter. This is not a technical issue. What's happened, let's be clear what the judgment said. The Secretary of State acted beyond his powers, failed to provide the details of workfare schemes within the regulations, bypassed Parliament by introducing this umbrella scheme, the Employment and Skills Enterprise Scheme. It's not a technicality. In fact, let me just quote from the judgment from Lord Justice Stanley Burton. He basically said, any scheme, the loss of job seekers, sorry, let me start again. He said, there is a constitutional issue involved. The loss of job seekers allowance may result in considerable personal hardship. It's not surprising that Parliament should have been careful in making provision for the circumstances in which the sanctions may be imposed. So what resulted in that? This is a fundamental constitutional issue. It meant that the government tried to slide through Parliament without adequate consideration regulations that would eventually deprive our constituents of significant sums of money. So what the decision has made is that the government has, let's be clear, has unlawfully required tens of thousands of people to work without pay. And then secondly, if they've said no, it's stripped them unlawfully of a significant amount of their benefits. Now, I'd quote from what the public interest lawyers actually said, what they think, who took the case. And I agree with what they've said. They said, look, there's basic requirements of fairness. And those basic requirements are usually dictated by Parliament. So it means the basic requirements of fairness on anything like these regulations is, first of all, providing people with a clear explanation of what they are being asked to do, why they're being asked to do it, and what the consequences are if they fail to do it. And that's simply, as a result of this judgment, not been complied with. So that's what this debate is all about. And the solicitor who represented the claimants, Tessa Gregory, I think summed this up very, very well. The case has revealed that the Department of Work and Pensions was going behind Parliament's back, failing to obtain parliamentary approval for the various mandatory work schemes that it was introducing. There was a lack of transparency and fairness in the implementation of the scheme. And the claimants had no information about what could be required of them under the Back to the Work schemes. The Court of Appeal has affirmed the basic constitutional principle that everyone has a right to know and understand why sanctions are being threatened and imposed upon them. That's what this is all about, isn't it? Now, let me just say, I think it is worth talking about the cases that determine the judge's actions in this case. The two cases, let me just, it's worth getting on the record. Jamie Wilson, the lorry driver, let me just quote from what he said, because I just find it staggering that the government even contested these cases. What he said is that I refused to participate in the Community Action Programme because I objected to being made to clean furniture for 30 hours a week for 6 months when I knew it wouldn't help me find employment. I was given next to no information about the programme. I was told simply that I had to do whatever the DWP's private contractor instructed me to do, and if I didn't, I may lose benefits. Being without job seekers allowance was very difficult for me, but I don't regret taking a stand. The Community Action Programme is poorly thought out, poorly implemented scheme, which even according to the DWP's own statistics is not helping anyone get back to work. And then he says that I think this is enlightening about the nature of the people we're dealing with. These are people desperate for work. What he then says, I'm now participating in the work programme, but it doesn't involve me working for free. I have to meet an advisor every 3 to 4 weeks who helps me look for work. I continue to attend these sessions with my advisor regardless of whether or not I'm required to attend, because I want to find a job. That's what people want. In the other case, Cait Riley, let me just quote from what she said. I brought this case because I knew it was wrong when I was prevented from doing my voluntary work in a museum and forced to work in Powderland for free as a part of a scheme known as the Sector-Based Work Academy. Those 2 weeks that I was at Powderland were a complete waste of my time, as the experience did not help me get a job. I wasn't given any training, I was left with no time to do my voluntary work or no time to search for a job. The only beneficiary was Poundland, a multi-million-pound company. Later I found out that I should never have been told the placement was compulsory. Can I say the Secretary of State has been quoted elsewhere as saying, does Cat Riley think she's above shelf stacking? I hope that's a misquote. If it was a quote, I think it should be withdrawn, because it's a disgraceful insinuation about the character of someone. Because let me go on, let me just explain what Cat Riley said. I don't think I'm above working in shops like Poundland. I now work part-time at a supermarket. It's just that I expect to be paid for working. That's all she asked for. I hope the government will now take the opportunity to rethink its strategy and do something which actually builds on young unemployed people's skills and tackles the causes of long-term unemployment. I agree we need to get people back to work, but the best way of doing that is by helping them, not punishing them. The government ought to understand that if they created schemes which actually help people to get back into work, then they wouldn't need to force people to attend. That's the young woman who actually took this case, and I congratulate her for taking the case, because if she hadn't, we would not be in this situation today where we're seeking to at least contest what the government is doing. And I agree. Let's just be clear, the intent of this bill. The government's acted unlawfully. It's robbed some of the poorest people in our society of between, well, on average, £500 in their benefits. And the amount means a lot. As others have said, it means a lot to people who are living on the breadline. And now they use this retrospective device to avoid paying back to these poor people what they should not have been deprived of in the first place. And the argument is that they possibly robbed the poor of 120 million to pay this back would damage the economy, to be frank, is derisory, isn't it? Absolutely derisory. It's laughable and derisory. Actually, as my honourable friend from Wansbeck has said, if the £120 million was given to the poor who need to spend this money, it would actually help to boost the economy rather than have any impact on it. But to suggest it's a threat to the economy when bank has been bailed out to 1.2 trillion is absolutely laughable from any government logic that's been put forward. And can I say also, this issue that if we pay this money back, it has to be paid from other claimants, is the classic strategy of divide and rule by this government, through its welfare benefits policy. I have to say, as my honourable friend has said, this use of retrospective legislation is simply making sure that illegality is made legal and sets an extremely dangerous precedent. But I don't think it's anything to be frank, I don't think it's anything to do with the money. I don't think it's anything to do with the taxpayers. I don't think it's anything to do with the economy. I think this is about prejudice against the poor. I think this is about the demonisation of the unemployed. I think it's the iron heel of a prejudiced state. But I also think it's about the preservation of a large pool of unpaid labour for large-scale corporations to exploit. The government, it's now estimated, will put through 250,000 people on work experience, 850,000 on work programmes, over 70,000 on the mandatory work activity. The last calculation was that this is something like 60 million hours of free labour to these corporations. I think that's an exploitation. It can't be turned in any other way. I think the last 2 decades we've seen a transformation in how unemployment is considered, discussed and viewed. Governments since the Second World War had a commitment to full employment and saw as a responsibility their role to ensure full employment. There have always been sanctions within the system to prevent people abusing the system, but it was about ensuring that they were sanctioned if they refused to go for paid work. It was never with regard to unpaid work. But now, just when unemployment is at its highest and it's the hardest to find a job, the attitude is that unemployment is not the fault of the system, it's not a failure of government, it's a failure of the individual, not society. It's the individual that's to blame, not the society that's caused unemployment. And therefore the logic follows on that the individual must be penalised. So what the government has successfully done in the media and elsewhere by ministerial statements is demonise the unemployed. The unemployed themselves have caused their own poverty rather than the system that's created the unemployment. So the result of this logic is what we're seeing today, that the poor and unemployed have to be harassed, pilloried, sanctioned and blamed and made to feel guilty for even being unemployed.
Agree with me that not only have the government shown no contrition whatsoever on this issue, which is a mess of their own making, but actually what they're trying to do is to scapegoat those people who've been sanctioned illegally.
Yeah, quite right. I think it's that, but I think it's a wider agenda. I think it's making people feel guilty just because they're out of work. Guilty just because they have to, for a temporary period in most instances, have to depend on some benefits. This is about the scapegoating and victimising of the poor and people who can't get a job. It's about harassment and exploitation. And the judgment is at the heart of this. The judgment that Parliament was not properly informed of what these schemes and regulations meant to people. That's what the judgment said. So I think before we vote tonight, and I make this clear, I'm voting against this bill. I'm voting against this bill because I think it's immoral and it's wrong. But before we vote to render these schemes lawful again, retrospectively, I think it's important that we members are aware of the sort of schemes we're voting to support. Boycott Workfare, which is an organisation that's set up.
Wherever it is, we can certainly hear it. McDonnell, let's go.
There's probably someone looking for a job.
Hopefully somebody will answer it then.
Let me just go back. Before we vote tonight, I think it's important that we know we're voting as part of the support for the schemes, the workfare schemes that are being introduced for the government, because the bill itself will enable the sanctions to be continued and to be, I suppose, retrospectively made legal because people refuse to go on these schemes. And I think justifiably refuse to go on many of these schemes. Let's just take some of the examples that are on the Boycott Workfare website. Tesco's is a classic. Let me just give you one of the examples. 56-year-old man worked for Tesco's for 40 hours a week for 6 weeks, no pay. He was given the worst job, constantly filling freezers in the hope he'd be taken on. After 6 weeks, when they were up, he asked the manager if the manager asked him if he'd like to stay on for some extra weeks. And he said, with pay? He said no. The manager said, why would he pay him when he can pick the phone up and get more unemployed people who could work for nothing? That was Tesco's. And it goes on. Poundland's a classic example of the exploitation of unemployed people. Again, time and time again, recruiting shelf stackers whilst they lay off other workers. Primark. Let me give the example of Primark. One of the young women that went to Primark, the job centre paid travel money but no lunch. I worked there for 3 days a week, 10 a.m. to 4:30 or 5 p.m. with 1 half-hour break. Primark don't pay any money. It was nearly 6 months from January to June. When I finished the placement, I took my CV and I asked the managers if they had any vacancies. They said, not yet. We'll call you when we do. Haven't had a call since.
I think we're giving away. Is he aware that there are companies that also do this who gain people who've not come through the job centre, who go and apply for a job and then asked to work for 3 or 4 weeks on probation and then told to go, and then their colleagues come in and replace them? And so there are shops even in the West End that have a large number of totally unpaid staff on a permanent basis.
The whole point of this whole exercise, as far as I can see, although there are arguments, this makes people job fit. We now know actually what this is a massive exploitation of tens of thousands of people for free labour. And I won't go through all the examples, but it's worth looking at the Boycott Workfare website, because example after example of people being exploited, working in unsafe conditions with lack of health and safety, and then just sticking at it, just to try and get a job at the end, and never getting that job, never materialises. And what happens then is they get sanctioned. If they say no or they drop out, they get sanctioned. Sanctions have increased dramatically in this country. In 2009, 139,000 job seeker allowance claimants were sanctioned. By 2011, that had gone up to 500,000. It had tripled. And it's risen again this year. And what's interesting is the private companies that recommend the sanctions to the DWP. And the worst are Serco, CTEC, A4E, Working Links. If they don't get their pound of flesh, if they don't feel they're getting their value for money from someone who's unpaid, they then recommend it to the DWP that a person gets sanctioned. Yet, there's an irony here, though, isn't there, really? Despite all this pain and anxiety, yes, and suffering inflicted on unemployed people, the irony is that these schemes are proven not to work. As my honourable friend on the front bench has said time and time again, all the evidence is demonstrating, whether it's from the Social Services Advisory Council, the peer group reviewing the DWP, the Ben Goldacre work, the latest from the National Audit Office, not only do they not work, but as others have said, they undermine wages for people who are in work and prevent others getting the jobs that could possibly be paid at the end of the day. I feel now that we're in a situation where there's large numbers of people who are extremely angry at the way that they've been treated. I believe there's many people now who are willing to stand up and say we're not going to be treated in this way. And that's why the sanctions system now is becoming even more rigorous, and that's why it's important for the government to get this legislation through, because they want to intimidate more people. They want to force more people into work that they don't want to undertake and work that's done for free. It's worthwhile just stating that actually what this is about is exploitation of people. It's about making sure that young people in particular are intimidated into unpaid work. And actually by introducing this legislation now, it means those people who actually, in my view, were brave enough to say, I'm not willing to take unpaid work, I'm not willing to be exploited in this way, and then, yes, even if necessary, I'll be sanctioned because of that. It's actually saying to them that now they've been proved to be right because they weren't informed of what they were going into. They were bright enough to understand the level of exploitation and they stood up against it. Now we're saying, now that they've won in court, we're going to try and ensure that they don't get justice. That's what this bill is all about. Well, I urge members tonight to vote for justice. This bill is a disgrace. It's a monument to a combination of incompetence by the government and brutality on the poor. I look forward now to the Labour Party considering what it's doing here today. I urge members to vote against this bill because I think those people out there are looking for the Labour Party to defend them again, to stand up for what is right and what is just, to stand up for people in our society who are exploited, to stand up for those ones who are actually, yes, are at the bottom at the moment, unemployed, unable to get a job, dependent on benefits, desperate for work, and don't expect to be harassed and exploited by a government using sanctions to force them into unpaid work. That's why I'm voting against this bill, and that's why I urge all members to vote against the bill, to demonstrate someone in this House is standing up for those people.